record on this computer. Hi, everybody. This is a class for Northshield's Virtual Fighter Symposium. I'm Gawin Kappler. I'm a member of the Order of Defense in Palantir, and Master Dante is joining me to teach this class titled 10 Ways to Improve Your Italian Rapier Fight. In general, we just have a list of 10 items. We're going to talk about each of those and have a bit of a discussion about them and take questions. So we'll get started with number 10, and that is read the manual again and again. So one of the big problems in people who do quote Italian Rapier is that there's a lot of stuff that people believe about Italian Rapier that is not what's in the book, or is something that someone in the SCA created in their mind, or they missed some things that are important and have kind of adapted, and then now you're on a fourth generation of playing with adaptations. So go read it again is certainly the first piece of advice here.
From my own experience, and I'm predominantly a Capaferro student. That's where the bulk of my focus has been. But I used the Fabris manual to fill in a lot of information, because that's kind of the most complete manual in terms of its discussion. And you know, a lot of people will recommend like Gigante or Capaferro because they're simpler texts, but that's actually a reason to not focus on them exclusively, because they have gaps, and Fabris has fewer gaps. So when we say read the manual again, the way that I approached the Fabris manual was I would read so first I read it cover to cover a few times, because not all the concepts make sense in isolation. So you have to have a general sense of the whole thing. So I read it cover to cover probably half a dozen times, let's say. And then there are 18 theory chapters. And I would read chapter 1 and I would think about it. And I would read chapter 1 again and then read chapter 2 and then think about how those two things connected together. Then I would read chapter 1, 2, and 3 and think about how those connected. And then chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 and think about how those connected, and so on down the line. So by the time I was all done with it, I'd read those earlier chapters, you know, a dozen times or more, and had that, you know, had that repeating basis for all of my understanding. It's not something that can be, you know, glossed over. It's not stuff that can be even absorbed one time through. It really genuinely has to be studied. And so you have to use study skills similar to what you would use if you were trying to pass you know, like a college course, and you really wanted to, you know that material in a deep and profound way. You've got to be consistent with it.
And Dante, you've created a sort of instructional, or a instructor test that would be a good thing to use for like a study guide too, to be able to think about your reading, to be able to answer the questions on that, right?
Yeah, I made something. I based it on, in part, on the Decatur School of Arms' certification tests. You know, 'cause a lot of it overlaps, and you shouldn't be asking wildly different questions about the same system. And I've added a lot of stuff about just educational process and things like that, because it's ultimately intended to be a coaching guide, a teaching guide, so that someone who answers all of the questions thoroughly pretty much has their own full-blown fencing manual interpretation, and also has added on their own full-blown lesson plans, curriculum, and so forth, so as to be able to turn the completed test into, hey, I have this thing that now lets me teach this entire Italian rapier system from the ground up without any additional work on my part.
So we just had someone join us. So we've only gone and done number 10 so far, which is read the manual again, make sure you understand it. But I think that gets us ready to go on to number 9, which is probably one of the easier, simpler ones on this list, is align your thigh and knee with your foot. So this is a very basic mechanics issue, in part because if you're doing things like lunging and your thigh and your toe aren't lined up, you can damage your knee. But the other thing from a fencing well perspective is that your lunge is going to go wherever your toe is pointed. And so if your toe is pointed off to the left or something, you're not going to go where you might think you're going. I don't know if there's much more that Dante has to add for that.
I do not have a lot more to add to that. Other than to say, one of the ramifications of this that may not be immediately obvious is if you go off at a slight angle and you are not intending to go off at that slight angle, there's a very high likelihood that your hilt's not in the way of your opponent's point anymore. So it's not just it's not just a safety issue. It's not just things aren't happening the way they're expecting to. It's also just making you worse. So you're getting bad outcomes across the board in every sense that there is, not just one or two.
The way I have sort of helped newer students measure this is I have a dowel rod that's about 4 feet, and I have them come and guard. I put the bottom of the dowel rod just outside their small toe, with their right foot, about the shoe, and I have them first point that foot where they're supposed to be going, but then I have them try to, usually it's need to bring the knee and thigh outwards to open the hips up more so that the outside of their knee touches that dowel rod in stance, which is further than I think a lot of people would think it is. But it's really to get them used to having that hip open. All right, so number 8 on our list, to move on from there, is to put your weight on your heels. This is going to be one of the more controversial points, I think, on this list. The sort of short version for why to do this, I'm sure Dante is going to add more, is number 1, a lot of the motions we're doing when we fence are pushing. And pushing through your heels is more mechanically efficient than trying to push through the ball of your foot, in part because your ankle is a hinge, and if you're trying to maintain your ankle's, I guess that's technically extended position to be on the ball of your foot, then you are resisting your quadriceps, your gluteus, and your hamstring, which are very large muscles, with the muscles in your calf. And so your brain will automatically crank back the power you have from your upper leg to make that work. So you won't notice the fact that you are literally crippling your mechanical ability to use your muscles, because your brain will automatically solve the opposition problem for you, and it really weakens your ability to lunge. And then there's some other issues of how your body is balanced, because you now have a lot of very small, easily fatigued muscles trying to support your positioning in your lower leg. And then you can do more damage on your knee when you land the lunge on the ball, because if you land on the hip, the foot coming down is a break. But if you land on the ball, it's very easy to go past with that knee and puts a little more shock into the knee. It would otherwise be handled by flexing the ankle. So Dante, do you have more to that?
Sure. So one of the things that I want to be clear about is we're not saying to be on your heels and not have any weight on the balls of your feet, because that's not a good way to balance. It's the issue is when you are taking your steps and when you are lunging, that the heel is what is taking the pressure, that you're pushing through the heel and not through your toes. Your toes are more a stabilizer at that point and not bearing the brunt of anything. And it really does make a substantial difference with your overall stability. If you watch people who are doing this stuff on the balls of their feet and you watch them drill their lunges and then watch them stop in the lunge position, they shake because their bodies are not physically capable of supporting their own mass at that point. You know, there's too much going on for those little muscles and to do that work, so they wobble. And
It's very subtle, but like you have to look for it. It's easy to just not notice if you're not like knowing to look for it, but it's there.
yeah, once you know that it's there and once you know what to look for, it's very, very apparent. And you know, what you really want to try to get to is a point where someone can't as easily deflect your sword. We have a couple of other points coming up on this list that connect into that, but the footwork is where this first shows up. And pushing through your heels gets you into a situation where it's harder to move you away from where you're trying to go.
In the last class, we had talked a little bit about the idea that you're driving an iron rod for a person when you fence them, not just trying to touch them. And so you're building mechanics that are far more like a barbell squat than, you know, tap.
Yeah. And one caveat to add is, you know, there are a lot of other athletic circumstances where the balls of the feet are the correct thing to do. But this is not that. And so arguments around, you know, oh, if I'm trying to run, I'm going to run on the balls of my feet. Well, okay, fine. You know, I bicycle differently than I run, and and I walk differently than I run, and you know, my throwing a football doesn't resemble my bowling very much. Uh, they're different things. And so it doesn't matter if one thing is better for one if it's not better for the other. And most of the people who are doing ball of the foot stuff or advocating for that, you know, they're fundamentally doing something that is not appropriate for Italian rapier. And so as a consequence, there's this cascade of other things that they do that also end up being adjustments instead of doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so they might have a degree of success, but it's all based on a culmination of small errors that have blended together into something that's passable.
So I think that starts then into number 7, which is one of the areas where you'll start making adjustments. And that is that your hips need to be more profiled than you think. And you should essentially be sitting into your stance on your rear leg. So I talked a little bit about in the last class, but there's a sort of vertical line that should pass when you're in stance. And we can see the pictures behind Dante. This is kind of true. You can see the fencer over his left shoulder. His left butt cheek is going to be roughly over sort of his heel in vertical alignment, knee and shoulder and toe. But if you imagine that there's sort of an invisible stool that you're kind of trying to sit onto that's sort of underneath that rear left butt cheek, that will help you get an idea both for how much your legs need to be bent, but also some of where that profiling needs to be. A lot of people are they're profiled, but they're actually about 3 inches from where their hip needs to be. It needs to be like that last 3 inches, because that last 3 inches is very hard. And sinking a little deeper into that to really engage their hip muscles that allow their lunge to work correctly.
Yeah, a good way to check for that for yourself is, so your rear heel is, if you're doing like a Capoferro type thing, so something more upright, your rear heel, your rear hip, and your rear shoulder are all pretty much in a straight stack. And so that's pretty visually obvious if you look at somebody. What often throws people off is that rear foot needs to be turned slightly backward away from your spine. So it doesn't have to be like really extreme, because that's not necessarily comfortable for everybody, but it needs to be just at least a little bit. And then your rear knee will go over your foot so that it's all lining up, and the top center part of your thigh isn't going to be straight, it's going to be rotated back along that same line.
Yeah,
So
it's often we think about put your feet at a 90-degree angle, and it's really put your hips in the right place, and your left foot's going to go kind of where it has to, based on your flexibility in that position, which isn't necessarily strictly 90 degrees.
yeah, ultimately, we get a lot of people who, they face their opponent with their hips squared or like at 3/4, and really what you're looking for is something that is much more like 80 or 90 degrees even. Yeah, really, you're really going for something linear, to the point where your offhand is almost even out of play in a lot of situations. Once you start to twist and lean forward and do other things that bring your offhand more into play, you have to be very conscious of where your hips go and that they don't follow your shoulders at that point.
Yeah, and this is another one of those areas that as soon as you would say put your weight into the ball of that rear foot, your entire ability to balance in that stack becomes impossible.
Yep.
Like, that's how deep you need to be sort of squatting into that leg in that positioning. And you don't do squats from the balls of your feet once you have weight going on, or it's bad.
Bad things happen to your spine.
All right, so moving on to number 6. So this is, again, a consequence of what we're talking about, is that when you lunge, you're going to be pushing through your rear leg to do it. You're not flinging your body weight forward and just kind of letting that leg trail. So a lot of people throw themselves and then their rear leg comes up off the ground and flies into outer space. You have to be driving the lunge by pushing through that leg and putting our weight through that heel, and then sitting down into that sort of squat position over that rear leg is building a coil that is set to extend very powerfully. But the whole thing is a push through that leg. The other thing that people will do is they'll actually kind of step with their right foot and then just pull themselves, and our legs are not good at pulling. It's not a thing they're good at. They're good at pushing. Like, they spend all day with us standing on them, pushing us against gravity. So it's really what we're best at doing with our legs. And that is the biggest thing for lunging correctly, is that it's driven off that rear leg.
Yeah. And from an efficiency standpoint that goes along with this, what you want to avoid, and you can, if your feet are in the right place, if your hips are in the right place, if everything is stacking up the way you want it to, you want to avoid vertical movement when you lunge. Anything that you do that's upward, and this is a consequence that often happens as a result of being on the balls of your feet, because they're on the balls of their feet, and so they want to kind of drop and then pop back up a little bit, because that's how those work. And all of that vertical motion is wasted if you're in the stance correctly, and you remove the buttress of your front leg by taking a step with it. you can then use your rear leg to drive through your heel, drive your body forward, and so your head won't bounce up at all. Nothing will come up further away from the ground. It'll all be forward and and somewhat down. And you can you can save yourself uh, a few fractions of a second that way, and give your opponent that much less information and opportunity as a tell. I'm often able to thrust and counter time when someone attacks me, because I see those little pops and tensioning of muscles and hops up and down, because they have to shift themselves to be ready because their initial stance isn't good. And if I see somebody's head pop up a little bit because I know they're going to come forward, well, I can put my point where their face is about to be. And it's not that hard to do once you know to look for it. So it's better just not to have that habit at all.
So I tend to sort of think about it like, you think of the old steam engines, there's that rod that pushes and it turns the wheel, because you're extending that rear leg, but you need to avoid going up as you do it. So you have to kind of think of your hips as being constrained from the top, so that you push into an imaginary force field that you're creating with your muscles, and instead of pushing past the force field, it drives it forward. Is the way I sort of conceptualize that, but that's kind of the twofer. Your hips have to work correctly, or none of that happens. All right, so I think it's a lot of what we had for the legs. So we're going to move up to the arms.
Quick question. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
When you're talking about the lunge, you're talking about pushing through the heel. So I'm having lots of cognitive dissonance because of my own background. So things to process. Are you advocating a deep lunge or a relatively short lunge,
So
pushing from the heel?
In the Italian Rapier system, have the front foot move about 1 foot length.
Okay, so it's the short.
It's a fairly short
I'll
lunge.
call it old guy lunge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your body leaning
Okay.
is what's going to give you the distance.
And
thank you.
Yeah, and you could do a longer one. I don't. And a lot of that, even though I'm short, I don't do a very deep lunge, and a lot of that has to do with if you are thinking about the sword like it's a sword and thinking about the duel like it's with sharps. I want to be able to change direction. I want to be able to adjust quickly. So a very deep lunge, like you might see, some of the people that are competing like in the Olympics have these like astonishingly athletic, huge lunges that are mind blowing for what they're doing. But if those swords were sharp, you wouldn't really do that, because if you miss, or if you just don't incapacitate the other person outright, you're kind of stuck there and you're very, very vulnerable. So with that in mind, I like to do a short lunge that I can very quickly turn into passing steps forward, natural steps, turn into a girata of some kind or some other void if I need to, because it's context. It's because of the context.
I have a quick question, if you have a minute.
Sure.
So in Fabris, as opposed to Capo Ferro, as I interpret it anyway, when you're attacking in second or third, you're kind of bringing your left hip forward into a more forward position, which I find makes it a lot harder to remain on your left heel as opposed to your left ball of your foot. So do you do strictly Capo Ferro, or do you still tend to lunge off your back heel if you're turning your left hip more forward to gain more strength in a second or a first position?
Okay. So, I know what you mean. The lunges in in fourth and the lunges in second aren't really the same, because if you have that narrow profile in second, there's a good chance you can get picked up in the back. So you need to roll that shoulder forward. Your hips don't necessarily need to rotate very much to get your shoulder forward. And I am still driving through my heel to lunge. If I am attacking in second or on the outside like that, or under their sword in second, which I do very frequently, the initial step is still pushing through the heel. Once my front foot has hit, my back foot is off the heel and is going to be coming forward, with a pass to kind of continue my path forward.
Mhm.
I almost never lunge in second and then just stop. I usually lunge in second, try to get the strike, and then kind of propel myself past them and kind of do like a walk away sort of thing. Because again, I'm trying to get myself past their point to a position of safety. So there's much more continued forward motion, but the initial startup is not different.
And a thing that I think is not obvious on how bodies move and are depicted in Fabris, but there is a level you need to understand that your hips can bend and twist independently. So your torso is kind of able to do this kind of rotation,
Mm-hmm.
while your hips are still kind of stationary.
Sure.
So you kind of, well, the wrist doesn't quite do it, but there is a level of getting your hips down and in bent, and that you can roll the shoulder by twisting at the hips without moving the hips themselves. And that kind of rolling motion is very, I think, central to doing Fabris's stuff. And is consistent with an idea that the Italians really liked about coming out of the Greek ideas of physics, that there are certain types of motion that are more perfect than others, and rotation is the most perfect. But like, it's a rotation of the body, but you get the hips in position in that squat, and then you can actually bend and roll in the forward plane differently than how your hips are. And that's sometimes hard to feel and learn to do and unpack. I don't know how much Finn is still paying attention, but I have tortured him with all sorts of exercises for this.
I've been paying full attention.
No, he's talking to me. Telephone drill.
Yeah, I called it the telephone drill, and it was essentially you start in guard, like a normal Capo Ferro Terza, maybe with a slightly narrower stance. You put your hand up by your ear like you have a telephone. You pay attention to tucking that elbow down. And then what you're going to do is you're going to extend the arm, you lean forward, and then you're going to roll through quarta de secunda and then back up. And this is all done very slowly, like sing yourself an Enya song while you do it. Kind of slow. But the idea is to really work on that hip bend being independent of the torso roll.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on to, we're going to move on to hands, and this is going to be our next most controversial point, probably. And that is your sword should be aligned with your forearm, and you should have one finger through the grip. So.
And we mean actually aligned. I've seen a lot of people who, they say like, oh, it's lining up, but it's not. The bones of your forearm are pointing straight, more or less, and your sword should really go like actually in line, like 180-degree flat line.
So a lot of people hold their sword like this. That seems correct, right? But if you actually look at the depictions in these Italian rapier manuals, in Giganti, in Capo Ferro, in Fabris, a really important point is that the pommel is located between the radius and the ulna, not beneath the hand. It is here. So this is what we mean by sword aligned with the forearm, is that pommel sits between your arm bones, not inferior to the ulna. It is right here. And so if you're doing and holding your sword this way, there's a lot of stuff in the system that just does not work at all.
Yeah, mostly dealing with the blade work too, which it turns out is pretty critical.
Yeah, well, that's the next point, cavationes. But here, so the pommel sits here. Now, the other thing I said is 2 fingers through, or 1 finger through the grip. Because if I try to do this position and stick a 2nd finger through the grip, you see where the pommel changed, and you see how my wrist changed. I now have an angle introduced at my wrist where I have an ulnar deflection, which is how you get your hand broken and your wrist broken when you impact things with it. This is a very weak physiological position to have your wrist in. And because a lot of us are just trying to be gentle and trying to touch, usually doesn't jam that wrist. But especially if you go to a hemocircles, if you're going to give people your hand like this, they're going to put you in a wrist lock. Easy. Versus 1 finger allows you to do this alignment. And it's that like 3 to 5 degrees of change from adding another finger that causes that disruption. So it's very subtle, but when I said, number 10 was read the manual again and again, that is one of the constant points people miss when looking at the guards, is that the position of the pommel is between their 2 arm bones, not below their hand. One of the other big things that kind of can make this tricky is a lot of our SCA sword guards have a handle that is way too long, and that makes that harder. I don't know if you have much more to add to that, Dante.
Yeah, no, not in particular. Yeah, this is just one of those instances where, and I think this is worth highlighting, where there are actually right answers for things about what to do and how to do it. And some of the things that people believe to be innocuous differences are actually critical and have real ramifications. So doing things differently is sometimes just outright harmful, even if it's not immediately apparent, and even if you are able to take other sorts of compensatory steps to balance it out, it's still a problem. It's still a mistake. It's just a mistake that you're not noticing the outcomes of, because you don't have the frame of reference to understand how much of a difference it really does make.
And our biggest example of that is point number 4, which is the cavazione is performed around the center of the mass of the sword, using it as a pivot. So if we are holding our sword the bad way we just talked about like this, a cavazione needs to be a very large circular motion to get around your opponent's weapon, because you need to avoid it with this whole section that's no longer in plane with it. So you have a wall that you have to move around theirs. If we align everything in our forearm, like we were just talking about, like it says, this is a cavazione. That's it. That's the entire motion.
It's slightly smaller, as you may notice.
A little bit. And what that allows you to do is really rely on how swords are balanced. So if you have a sword handy, you can feel this yourself, but you'll find a position 3-4 inches in front of your guard usually, where the sword itself balances. And at this point, any energy pointing down on your handle, right, it will move the rest of the sword pretty easily. You're not actually needing to move the sword's weight. You're just adjusting whatever force you add. And you can, easily pivot this in space. Because as long as this balance point, this center of mass of the sword, remains physically in the same location in space, the sword does not have inertia to overcome. relative to, the motion you're performing, because what goes up must come down is perfectly balanced here relative to gravity, and we're not doing translational motion with the sword, strictly speaking. Now, in practice, we extend our arm while we cavazione, always, but then we only have to worry about the extension as we do it. But this actually works easiest with a heavy sword. So a lot of Zen warrior swords that are like really light are hard to feel this point. But if you get that sort of heavier sword in hand, and you find that point, what you want to work on your cavazione is thinking about it as that point is what stays physically in place. And so your hand motion is literally just tipping on that point. And then specifically, your cavazione is always just going to start by letting the tip drop. That is the most important part of it, is just let that tip fall. And all you've had to do is let gravity drop it. So it's very simple, and that will literally make their sword miss. That drop is what makes them miss. Finn, we've done a drill, right, where I just have you do the drop. That's how we start training cavazione, is you just hold your sword out and we just have you do that drop, right? And
Yes.
when someone takes a giant sideways swipe at your sword and you drop and that's it, do they hit you? The correct answer is no. Right? Because that's what makes them miss. If you have this grip, drop that sword tip now is a very large action. I remember a couple of years ago, since Finn was one of the people I was training, when he would complain that doing the counterattack by cavazione was impossible. And it was because it is too slow if you aren't using this correctly. And how did it feel when you got it like right the first time, Finn?
Effortless.
Effortless.
Yeah, that's one of the big things with this is if you once you do it right, you'll never do it a different way, because the work level involved is just vastly different. It's so much easier. So if you're someone like, I've got carpal tunnel, so if you're someone who's got grip strength issues, it's just getting worn out quickly, that sort of thing. I use heavy rapier blades. I use baited blades. I use darkwood stuff. I use the baited blades only. It actually works better for me to have a heavier sword than it does for me to use one of those really thin, narrow, light blades, because those take more work to move. And so that's where you see people who are over moving, blowing out their elbows, blowing out their wrists, blowing out their shoulders. Whereas this, with a blade that's got some mass to it and a proper taper, I can do it all day, even with the wrist problems that I have, and it's not hard to do. While this may seem a little counterintuitive, the moment that you get it right the first time, you'll feel an immediate difference. And I can't imagine ever going back to doing it a different way. And I can't ever imagine going to, one of those very light, more sport tag style swords for anything.
That was probably one of our more complicated thoughts. Any questions on all that before we move on? All right. So number 3 is that sword extension should be performed to shoulder height, that you should push rather than flinging, and that you need to make sure not to lock your elbow. So there's a couple ideas here. We've talked a little bit about push, don't fling. If you fling your sword forward, there's a large part of that motion where it ends up moving away from your opponent, which is very counterintuitive, or in directions that aren't there, in places that don't have the ability to actually thrust through them. So with sharps, you might actually just bounce off the surface rather than hit them. If you hit the wrong part of the motion, it's just generally not efficient, and it really runs the risk of punching your opponents with a sword, all of which are bad. But other parts of this, one of is you want to extend just to shoulder height. So a lot of times people will get, oh, I have to parry my face, and their hand comes up here, and they extend.
And that turns out to be a really good way to get hit in the armpit.
Right? Because you're breaking up the line that defends, and that negative angle created by your sword now to keep it pointed at your opponent presents a weak angle for your defense, and they can just push right through it. So you have to learn to trust your guard at shoulder height, and if you're worried about your face, put it behind your arm.
Yeah, tuck your chin, basically.
Get your head here, not get your hand here. It's get here. And then the third part about the elbow locking. So basically, if you extend your arm forward, there's a point where your elbow isn't locked, and you can see that like my fingertip right now is pointed towards my left side relative to the camera, and my elbow is not locked. And as I move to lock my elbow, watch what happens to that fingertip. See that difference? My elbow like changed a centimeter, my finger changed like 10 centimeters, and my sword tip is going to move 5 feet. Right? So have you ever had the problem where you thought you were about to stab someone and you missed them over their left shoulder? That's what causes that, is hyperextending the elbow. There are other reasons not to do it, one of which is if your elbow is blocked and you run into something hard, it's not going to be fun for you. And likewise, it's really hard to cushion if your opponent decided they needed to jump into you when things change. If you're already locked, it's really hard to unlock. And then the third thing that is about fencing well is sometimes you have to change directions, and it's harder to do that when your elbow is locked. So that's kind of our thing.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, just this is another one of those cases where doing it the right way is not only better for you from a win-loss perspective, but it's also better for you from a safety perspective. Both your safety and that of your opponent, plus you get to win more. The kind of, there's sort of an underlying theme to a lot of these things, but because you're treating the sword as sharp, there's not really a need to generate a lot of power for things. What you're mostly looking to do is generate speed through efficiency, because you don't need to land a thrust very hard to get several inches of incapacitating penetration. But what you do need to do is land the shot, and you need to do it without getting hit. So a lot of the things that people try to do to make themselves feel like they're going faster is really just wasting energy on feeling strong and feeling quick rather than actually being quick.
So with it being the week of Thanksgiving, one of my favorite ways to talk about that and ask people is, on Thanksgiving, do you punch your turkey with a knife?
I mean, ever since you brought that example up, I do.
And if you did, how well would it actually carve the turkey? It's instead a pushing pressure that is continuous through the slice, not you frequently will actually just not even really successfully slice the bird if you punch it with the blade of your knife. So that's kind of part of that one. I think the other thing I was sort of going to talk about in 3, but is also part of 2, is that you really want your arm relaxed as you do all of this. You can't be tense. And number 2 on our list is pull your shoulder blades down. So this is a very subtle thing that everybody I've explained this to has thought is the most amazing thing since sliced bread. So yay. But it's easy for you when you're in guard and you have your sword and maybe your arm gets tired to really hunch up your shoulders and be tense and keep your arm here. And this is not relaxed. This is very tense. A lot of people, maybe coming from an armored combat background, are trying to like throw that shot and be tense that way. Or people are mentally thinking about, well, we're fencing, so what I'm thinking about is hitting my opponent with my weapon, which is a bad way of thinking about things. And all of these create tension in your whole arm and frame. When what you're instead doing, and I think was some of what Dante kind of hinted at, is you are getting yourself in a position where you can hit them, they can't hit you, and you're just going to carry your weapon through them by walking into them. And so what you want to do is get your shoulders, you know, here and relaxed, your arm relaxed, and then pull the shoulder blades themselves down. Okay? It's not tense in, it's not like out, it's not up, it's down. And this has, even from a neutral position of they're kind of neutral and relaxed here versus down, has a serious effect of chaining your posterior chain muscles to your arm. So you have very big muscles in your back and your legs on the back side of your body that are the posterior chain. So if you're doing exercises like barbell squats or deadlifts, this is what you use, right? So they're big, powerful muscles. And your arm is wimpy in comparison. And so if you're fencing and you aren't pulling the shoulder blades down, people can push your arm around to a certain extent. Obviously, you can try to resist. That resistance is coming out of your biceps and triceps and your shoulder, which makes it tense, right? That makes it very hard to be relaxed. So one of the things I think is an example of this difference is there's a brief part of Cappler where he mentions that the false edge of the foible is a strong place to parry and have leverage, which is somewhat counterintuitive to all of his other advice, right? So if and when you have a chance to do this with a partner, go put your sword out and say second, actually quarta, go in quarta, and have someone press on the outside edge, you know, the false edge of your foible. Then pull your shoulder blades down and have them do the same thing. And you'll feel how that allows you to engage all of your back and leg muscles to resist that push that otherwise seems like it should have a huge advantage for your opponent.
Yeah, that's one of the ways where sometimes you'll be fencing someone and it will seem like they are just an absolutely immovable wall for reasons that aren't immediately clear. There's a good chance that it's this kind of musculoskeletal alignment that's allowing them to be that way. And this all connects back down because the shoulder trick doesn't work as well if your hips aren't in the right place. Your hips don't work as well if your feet aren't in the right place, and your feet don't work as well if you're on the balls of your toes versus on your heels. So going up, so starting up on that weak foundation has all of these other ramifications, and ultimately, leads to a cascade failure where some techniques simply will not work, even though they should work every time.
And I think actually, so from a anatomy perspective, if Dante would put his arm down, if you look at the plates behind his head, right, we have Thibaut on what is our left and Fabris on our right, switch directions for Dante. But in both of those stances, if you pay attention to the anatomy, they are illustrating shoulder blades being pulled down, despite the fact the arm is up in prima or second. If the arm is up, but the shoulder blades are pulled down, and it's really part of why the picture of Thibaut there on the left looks like it does in the back. It kind of looks weird if you think about how you see human anatomy usually, but it is because it's arm up while pulling the shoulder blades down, and that's what creates that particular curve of the shoulder. So it's a very subtle detail, but it shows up in the pictures if you know the anatomy to see it. All right, so we have one more item, and if you were in the first class, spoilers, it's extend your arm first. So if you're being attacked, if you're attacking your opponent, the first thing your response should pretty much always be is extend your arm.
Yep. And that's consistent throughout all of the Italian systems that I've seen at all. Faber says the more extended versions that are the good guards as opposed to the natural ones that are not as good. And it's a big factor in those well-formed guards is that they're more extended than not. Cappafero has a little bit of a bend to his elbow, but he's still saying that your upper arm is forming an obtuse angle and it's only somewhat bent. And explicitly says that if you bend it too much and have it too close to you, your guard doesn't work at all. And this is a vital thing that a lot of people don't do, and a lot of people who don't drill their lunges correctly to learn how to do it the right way end up with this automatic motor response where they step first and then extend their sword, and that's terrible.
It's even a lot of people who are perform reasonably well and are sometimes well regarded making videos on the internet.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they're just misleading everyone because it's mechanically inferior. You can't disengage right if you're trying to do that. You are essentially leading with your face into someone else's sword. So if they are minding their measure, forming a counter posture, and able to take opportunities when you offer a tempo like that, you're going to be in bad shape. It's simply an inferior way to do things. If you look at how boxers learn to jab and do similar sorts of things like that, there's a way to do those things that is just better than other ways. And that's not to say that someone with very bad punching technique can't knock somebody out, but that doesn't mean that it was a good punch. And this is very similar. It's a fundamental thing that has been, especially for Italian rapier, widely accepted across decades and decades and hundreds of years, and I believe is something that is still considered to be a core tenet in the modern era, that when you lunge, your arm has to go first, and it's not a debatable thing. It's just better. And that's something that we in the SCA and to a similar extent in HEMA also encounter. Is there's a lot of debate about stuff that's not debatable, and arm first is really one of the most irrefutably necessary things, assuming you want to fence at your best. It's possible to be successful without that, but if you want to do the best job that you can, you have to do it the right way.
Yeah, Dante, I just want one last thought, because we're at the hour, but the channel can stay open to continue talking about things. But I just also wanted to add about extend first. It applies to cuts, and then say, well, that's pretty much what we have for the class, but we're still going to be here for questions. So if you need to go jump off to go to one of the other classes, feel free right now. We won't be insulted. But otherwise, Dante and I will talk your ears off.